Welcome everyone to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 38, and we are continuing our series on the dragon. And today, this one's taken a little while for me to get out. It's title of this one is The Dragon and the Cross, and it's kind of it's kind of one of these creative imagination exercises, but it's grounded in, I want to say, kind of like the Rosicrucian enhancement of the Christian tradition. So what I mean by that is, Christianity comes along, it's embraced, and then at certain points in history, there were efforts to shape it and change it. I mean, everything from the Council of Nicaea and the heretical texts, and then on through the ages, different myths get attached to it, and even the idea of Rosicrucianism, which in a way is the predecessor to things like theosophy and anthroposophy. But just to kind of, as if that stack wasn't enough, I kind of had been struggling to get this one out a bit, and I'm going to do something a little different today, and I'm going to use some visualizations that I will do in a non-editing way. How I like to perform these live. But I actually got the inspiration to push this podcast through with a rewatch, of all things, of Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0, which is Thrice Upon a Time. And just the idea of apocalyptic play that goes on in this, right? Where it's sort of taking the Christian icons and then reusing them in a very clever way. And I want to say that it touched on all the same points as some of these books that we see here. So we've got dragon Christology kind of coming in through Gardner's works, which we talked about last week, if you want to go check that out. Genesis of the Grail Kings, the idea of the bloodline of Jesus, and something with a dragon origin, so we can kind of go into that. But then even more so, the Evangelion sort of mythology of, this redo, the rebuild of Evangelion. We've talked about a couple of podcasts on Evangelion also. And the way anime can use, it doesn't have to make sense really with anime. Anime can kind of appropriate, and does, a lot of the world building, let's call it, in anime and in manga, can take bits and pieces from religion and history and just use it as a device. But what I think the interesting device that comes out of this is, I think Anno, in his creation of the rebuild of Evangelion, actually touches upon some kind of Gnostic ideas around what is this Manichaean heresy of reconciling the good and evil within oneself. And you can see this, and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit, but I probably will do an entire Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0, but I want to use that as sort of like the parallel lives, so to speak, of, we'll kind of talk about what Anno did, and then I'll kind of present something that I'm trying to present on this, the Dragon and the Cross. And sort of like a reconciliation a la Jung's Ion. And I think we'll start it all the way back in even the Steiner call out to the Archangel Michael. Steiner has this quote in the Archangel Michael where he talks about, while we can struggle with evil, Michael's job would be to redeem Satan. And I always thought this was kind of interesting. And I'll even, when I take you guys into the creative imagination version of this, I'm going to base it on a sort of a storyboard kind of mode, and I'll share that with you. So let's kind of go back to how, as we've gone through a number of the podcasts have talked about the dragon. So our voyage through this dragon story has taken us from everything from the Gardner books. We've talked about the idea of the dragon Tiamat, and slaying the dragon versus riding the dragon. We've talked about the Archangel Michael slaying the dragon versus maybe another creative way to think of interacting with the dragon. And I think we have with Anno in the rebuild of Evangelion, you really see that, this idea of a redo or not being able to redo, right? So the idea here is Anno wanted the original Evangelion to sort of end on this note of kind of calling out the genre, let's say, of anime as an escapism. So let's think of it as ego inflation, right? The anime world, you can ego inflate, and fans kind of get into the lore, and these fandoms come up, and then he kind of pulled that rug out from under them and turned it into a psychological story, and really like a redemption of Shinji, sort of. And this was really an alchemical journey that Anno took. And if you look at some of the details of 3.0.1.0, that and this is what really gave me this idea to kind of incorporate that into this dragon and the cross concept. There's this mention of fusing the world of imagination with the real world. So you have in the rebuild of Evangelion this series of impacts. The second impact, the third impact. They're kind of like the apocalypse event, and they're all kind of loosely based in this lore of Revelation and apocalypse, and it's got all these. They just kind of pull at some of these things: Adams and Liliths and angels and Evas or Eves, and the names of things all have apocalyptic imagery. But as we get into this, it's sort of like this reoccurrence of these impacts, this like idea of revelation and reimagining this revelation. It kind of really reminded me of Yogananda's idea of reimagining the second coming as a second coming of Christ within you, right? And I think that this theme is kind of like there in Anno, right? So the idea here is you've got the second impact, you've got the third impact, and there's one scene where Mari and Asuka, they're going deeper through the L field, this like LCL, and there's protection layers and Misoto's ships going through, and they keep talking about the idea of piercing through different ATV fields and traversing different levels of this L fluid, and they're descending deeper and deeper, which is kind of like an idea of then they're passing by infinite Evas, which are almost like all of us fans, all of us Evangelion fans, all the souls. And suddenly you see like, oh, wait a minute, they're kind of saying something here. This is a metaphor that's pushing the mix, like it's a stack of psychological metaphor of going into the unconscious. It's also a metaphor of religious apocalypse, and it's also a metaphor of taking the old Evangelion and then repurposing it to sort of mirror maybe Anno's self awareness and Anno's self idea, this Manichaean theme, right, of uniting the fear with the hope. They talk about uniting fear and hope and this human instrumentality with each soul as kind of a battlefield. And this reminded me of this, the idea of revisionism and the use of creative imagination, and even this idea of retrocausality, where, the need to preserve Genjo's love for Yui causes him to estrange from the son, and that causes the parent complex. And then it's just Shinji having to realize, hey, that was my dad's thing, and then he kind of moves on. And it's almost like Anno's moving on in his life, where his depression and his past things, maybe they've been replaced now. At the end, we have Mari and Shinji, they're grown up, and sort of like it's, you get a bit of ego inflation into the idea of all of these epic apocalypses. And then when you bring that ego inflation through the creative imagination, when you pull back from it and ground it back toward the genomic response, which is, well, this is just a depression, and you move through it and you work through this integration, finally you get to this place where, you're back. He's a guy on a train station with his girlfriend, and all of the Avas, we don't need the Avas anymore, kind of. So it's a metaphor in a lot of ways of Anno's journey. At the same time, though, that idea of a fan of the rebuilds in general, like I want to say that we've done a podcast on Jacques Lacan as the rebuild of Freud, right? And we look at Yogananda as the rebuild of the second coming, right? Because he's talking about the second coming within you. The concept is, it's not an apocalypse at the end of time. It's just that when you decide to stand in the Christ spirit, and now he comes into your heart, and this is the second. So it's a rebuild of Christianity. And I feel like this is a Rosicrucian theme, right? By adding some spiritual science on top of it. So we'll kind of get into that. And I feel these themes are present in 3.0.1.0, and they also align to, Jung's Ion, and even Rudolf Steiner's Miracle of Michael. So maybe let's start off at the top. We'll just go through these one by one. We'll talk about the Miracle of Michael here. The first one we have, this is the idea of the mystery of Golgotha, right? So you have Michael as slaying the dragon, right? Slaying the demon. But at the same time, you have this idea of, it says right here, as regards Michael, a change is now taken place. Michael himself has attained a further stage of development. This is of enormous importance, for according to occult knowledge, in the last few decades, we have entered into a new epoch inspired by the being which the mystery of Golgotha took place. Since the end of the 19th century, then, Michael may again be regarded as the leader of this epoch. So we're talking about Christ passing through the mystery of Golgotha at the gate of death at the time of the crucifixion, right? So the mystery of Golgotha imparted to the earth its meaning and purpose, he talks about, right? So, and we've talked a little bit before about this idea of integrating the dragon, right? And if we talk about integrating the dragon, which resonates with a lot of these, but if we look at what Jung has to say about this, he talks about the idea of, I would like, in conclusion, and this is in Ion, he goes, I would like in conclusion to mention this particular theory of the world in the Clementine homilies. In God, pneuma and soma are one. When they separate, pneuma appears as the sun and archon of the future aeon, but soma, actually substance and matter, divides into four. And he starts talking about the mixing of these four parts, and this is where the devil arose. And the idea here is the archon of this aeon and the psyche of this world. The soma has become psychized. God rules this world as much as the devil, as through the Son, for both are in his hands. So God unfolds himself in the world in the form of syzygies, which are paired opposites, such as heaven and earth, day and night, male and female, etc. Adam and Eve, the syzygies, right? So this anthropos quaternio, again, it's kind of got this Steinerized idea of Christ and the devil are like a hostile brothers. But the lapis, he says, the paired opposites in their ultimate unity, the parallel of the lapis and the Mercurius with Christ, because of the snake or dragon symbolism, also with the devil. And finally, the figure of Mercurius duplex of the lapis, which unites the opposites individually in itself. And this is, we get into that Nicene concept of Adam, Christ visits Adam, Adam and Christ are like also kind of man and serpent. We have all of these, dualities, but they all kind of merge in the Philosopher's Stone, right? So, again, if we go back to the dragon, and now this one is in the Genesis of the Grail Kings, and this goes all the way back to even the Apsu of Tiamat, and this idea of the Magdalene and the Lilith, and the Anunnaki origins of dragon, right? If we go back to the history of the Old Testament, and it links back to the Tiamat world creation myth, and you even have the word of Messiah having to do with a dragon, or the anointed one, and is also the dragons. And this is kind of like, a similar word might be like a Pendragon, right? The Arthurian Pendragon, the son of the dragon, right? The son of man, the son of the dragon. You have all of this imagery, and in the Gnostic space. I had two little quotes out of this. The man is fettered to the material body. And this is the idea that Yaldabeth, to extract from Adam the hidden power of the darkness, but unable to reach lest insensibility down upon Adam, out of his rib embody the thought of light in female form. Sobering from the intoxication of the darkness, recognizes this essence in her. So Christ taught Adam to eat of the tree of knowledge, which Yaldabaoth had forbidden him, lest he took upward to his perfection, noticing his nakedness. So the struggle of man is the struggle of spirit and counter-spirit. So you've got, this is where you have the idea of the demiurge, or Yaldabeth here, where Adam and Eve are put at odds against each other. Satan is put at odds against, knowledge is made to be satanic, right? And that's put against the Christ. And this idea of haimarmene, which is sort of this concept of this unity of the dark and the light, and sort of like the cross, so to speak, of both worlds. And it's through, I'll say through the early Christian dogma, it was enough to just sort of recognize the Holy Spirit. It was enough to just recognize the cross. But it seems that in the anthroposophical point of view, and even if we're going to look, and I'll read a bit from Yogananda's, there's an active way we can participate in this. And this is the idea of this luminous idea. So the original and profound interpretation of the figure of Christ was an important article of the Manichaean Creed, and is also known as the Jesus Patiblis, the passible Jesus who hangs from every tree and served up bound in every dish. Every day is born, suffers, and dies. He is dispersed in all creation, but his most genuine realm and embodiment seems to be the vegetable world in the most passive and only innocent forms of life. And at the same time, with every aspect of his nature, he is transmunde new, coming from above, liberates the captive substance, and continually, until the end of the world, collects it himself out of the physical dispersal, right? So, and it goes back, the mother of light and the living spirit, they send someone to this primal creature to free and save him. So they sent Jesus. The luminous Jesus approached the innocent Adam, and he follows a scene given where Jesus is here with the gods. In the mission of revelation to man, a more specialized hypostasis or emanation of the messenger. That is, he who makes Adam eat from the tree of knowledge explains the Christian accusation that the Manichaeans created Christ with the serpent in paradise. Right? So this is why the Manichaean heresy was such, because it was equating, well, if the Logos Christ redeems Adam, then each man is the battlefield of this good and bad uses of the knowledge, this integration of this knowledge, this hanging on the cross in all things. They saw that as kind of against their Yahweh order, right? So the idea here is, this is like, just to say, kind of, it's going to sound funny, but just to put it in terms, this is why Anno got death threats. Anno got death threats when he did his original ending of Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion, because the fans didn't like how he turned it from a mecha into a personal alchemical redemption story, right? So and this is interesting, because this is what the Manichaean heresy sort of faced against too. What was heretical about the idea of, if Christ can be the bringer of knowledge, it's just a more advanced way. It's because they wanted to enforce a good and evil, pro and con, and like use a fear-based, archonic-based fear, right, to keep things in line. And what I found super refreshing, and I could probably talk about it every other podcast, is this concept of Yogananda's in the kind of the idea of Christ consciousness is the second coming of Christ. So again, it says, advanced devotees who not only hear in meditation the blissful cosmic sound of the Holy Ghost, the Word, and the holy Om vibration, but merge their consciousness with the omnipresence of this sound and feel the universal Christ consciousness in it, they are the ones who witness the second coming of Christ in their consciousness. And it says, through Jesus can have informed Christ consciousness to appear in the Jesus form in God-related saints. He who manifests as the cosmic sound in the Christ consciousness in the devotee, then that is the true redeeming second coming of Christ, of which Jesus spoke. As a human being has a soul, mind, and body, so also God has an active soul in the universe. Right? It says, simply believing in the Trinity could not give anyone the God realization of Christ consciousness. So the idea is, how does one align oneself? And again, when we say align, it's like a crosshairs, right? Like, this is what the symbol of the cross is. But now it's not simply just, and I think it's always been in Christianity, it's just a matter of an anthroposophical form of it, right? The idea of a form that that puts the person beyond, it's beyond works. I don't think it's about works. I think it's about attunement to a certain kind of thinking. Okay, so now I'm going to do something that's just, it's so lazy of me, but I'll do it this way because I want to get you guys into the second process of this, and it will start out as me just doing something so janky, but you guys will see it in a second. Okay, so we'll just kind of zoom down in here, and we'll take this up like this. Okay, and we'll lock this in, and we'll move this down a bit, move this up a bit. Yeah, so the idea now is, what can we say about this, given what we've sort of given this intro? What can we sort of say about the creative thinking of Christianity when we look at it in terms of sorry guys, in terms of this kind of creative imagination. And I want to start you guys off with a story here. So what we have here is, think of this as a first pass at this story. I've been sitting on this for a little bit and didn't quite know how to present it, and this is how we're going to do it. So let's start out with a story. This is the story of a child's nightmare. So there was a child's nightmare in which, so this dream was told to me. The Catholic kid has a crucifix in the room, and one night has a nightmare about this crucifix. So, this is tapping deep into creative imagination, right? So the idea is, this nightmare is of a sound first. It's just the sound of some kind of like a grunting sound, right? And as the child looks at that crucifix up on this dresser, he sees the small Jesus on the cross attempting to pull his hand from off the cross, right? This is sort of the gateway of a Manichaean dilemma, let's call it, right? Right. So just, Christ not sacrificing himself, Christ trying to free himself, right? But the twist of it is, as Christ pulls the hand off, and then he pulls his feet off and kind of grunts and pulls the final hand, dangles off the cross and jumps down onto the dresser. And that small Christ figure walks around, but kind of impish. It's like a little impish, hissing imp. And it's a blasphemous kind of thing. It sort of seems very scary, right? And this idea of the freed Christ is now, freed from that crossing, we have this kind of impish figure, and then finally it hisses at the child screams awake, scared to death, frightening thing. But this, you can kind of see this comes out of that Christian iconography, right? It is quite frightening. It's a frightening iconography, right? You have this idea of, and the suffering of it, it's very intense, right? And I can remember, my mother talking about how she was terrified by the stories of the Christian martyrs, these kind of things that Catholics do, right? Catholics tell. And if you go into these, I can remember going into these Catholic stores as well. You could see like all of these religious icons and religious iconography. But imagine a new kind of iconography. Imagine playing with this image for a moment, like just using our creative imagination. Imagine one word that Jesus is coming off the cross. Like, it seems like, he does get taken off the cross, right? But what if he came off the cross? What if the myth was a little bit different? What is this telling us about the myth? Well, you start to look at that iconography of Jesus, but we'll introduce this new concept. So as we said in the intro, there's some of that indication back from Jung, talking about that integration of the Manichaean heresy, which was to say that there was the serpent on the tree, and then there's the Christ on the cross. Like, what's the serpent on the tree and the Christ on the cross? The serpent in the garden, right? Think of the serpent hanging from the tree and the Christ hanging on the cross. So what if we put those two icons together, right? What if we had Jesus, and instead of serpent, we'll have a dragon, right? And we just do this creative imagination of the dragon and the cross, right? The Christos and the Draconis, right? We put them together. So what would that do as a, say it's like a thought experiment or a creative imagination experiment? So you're like bubbling up the unconscious, like 2,000 years of Christianity, and having a take on it similar to a rebuild. It's a rebuild of the dragon and the cross, right? Thrice upon a time, right? So we imagine some of this iconography of, we've all seen Christ coming down off the cross, or the Stations of the Cross, right? In the Stations of the Cross in Catholic churches, they've got the 12 Stations of the Cross, and one of them is Jesus, or maybe several of them are Jesus stumbling with the cross, right? So you're carrying the cross. It's sort of like before and after the crucifixion, right? So imagine if you're just holding yourself in that area and saying, well, what if there's a dragon element to it? What if there was some kind of imagery of, we always talk about it was, as the man suffering, the man who is also God, right? And we also see angels depicted with wings. So imagine just for the moment, the image comes up of a winged angelic Jesus, like this luminous wings, but maybe they're dragon wings, just a thought experiment, right? So now you have this idea of the winged dragon. So it's almost like superimposing, if the snake in the tree is a dragon in the tree, and the cross and the snake, sort of like in the Jungian quaternio anthroposophic quaternio, you have heaven and hell and Christ and Satan. Let's merge it all into one image. Like, let's have the winged, let's redeem it, right? So we'll redeem this. Let's bring it together as a crucifixion of this Gnostic Jesus, this Manichaean Jesus, right? And we can bring this imagery forward. Even think of the Michael idea. So we talked in a past podcast about Michael. Instead of him slaying the dragon, what if we had Michael as riding the dragon, right? Or actually, what if Michael is the dragon, right? What if these guys are both some part of a dragon line, right? And this is in line with talking about the Tiamat myth and the origins of Judeo-Christianity back to Assyrian times. What is that dragon myth? Well, let's just superimpose it now and park it for a second. Michael as the dragon, right? Michael doesn't slay the dragon. Michael is the dragon, or Michael is riding the dragon. He's harnessing the dragon. And then we kind of see that this Michaeline force and this cross force, the dragon wings form the cross Christ forms the cross. It's not the dragon that's being slain. It's some aspect of some inferior aspect that is slain, some kind of baggage that needs to be removed, some kind of ignorance has to be stopped, right? So we're going to stop an ignorance. This is what's slain. And I think in the podcast on Michael, I talked about the fountain in Paris, where you see Michael slaying this kind of wormy looking man. And then there's the two dragons standing beside it, almost as like Chinese dragons, like guardian spirits. So now you see the idea of Michael and involved in this cross, this dragon cross, right? This dragon cross. The dragon is part of this cross now. And when you see this crucified dragon cross, you sort of get this idea a little bit differently. Like, why has the dragon also been persecuted, right? The dragon who is the king, right? The king is being persecuted. And you can get to a place where, I think Jung said it best, where he said evil got more evil with Christianity, because somehow these images could make people think it's some kind of satanic imagery. But we're going to be fully respectful in a Jungian integration way of this idea of a dragon like Christ who was crucified. He's brought down from the cross, right? Let's think of the classic Pietà, right? Christ is brought down from the cross, but imagine instead of slaying the dragon, what about mourning the slayed dragon, right? If we go with the narratives of you've got to slay the dragon, you slay the dragon, right? Well, why not integrate it? And why not mourn the slaying of it? Like, is there a mourning to slay the dragon, right? So you have this idea of the Pietà, where Christ's body is mourned by his mother. But if that were a dragon being slain, and you think of that same compassion goes out to that dragon. And if we could extend it to Mary through the Pietà and through the, through the Mater Dolorosa, right? Why don't we extend it to the Annunciation, right? Maybe that was a dragon, angel as a dragon, that came to Mary, right? To say that you'll bear the king, right? The Messiah. And we see this sort of in the same dragon imagery of the Annunciation, right? So we can imagine now like a rebuild of Christianity, right? We're doing sort of like what Anno does with his Evangelion, but we just apply it to Christianity. And that idea is, well, there's a king, a great, powerful being, an aeon that was bound to a cross, but bound to a cross by his own will, because he couldn't have stopped him, right? So you now have this thing that's powerful, but it's misaligned. Because we're so early out of the Christian era, it still has a kind of wrongness in the imagery. And yet if you kind of merge the two, if you bring in the Christ consciousness into the story, you see that this dragon concept is an alignment to a deeper power. So what is that power? What is that imagery? And maybe it takes us all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? Was it really evil? And this is where the Gnostics and the Manichaeans, who had been made heretics, right? Maybe there wasn't quite a casting out of Eden. Maybe it was just this Yaldabaoth kind of concept. So if we go all the way back and we start looking at what was the bloodline, what was being carried on, and between who and whom, with the dragon and the cross. And at the crosshairs of this, we still have the dragon crucified, but it starts to get almost, if we get to the heart of the matter, right? What's at the heart of the dragon and the cross? And what comes to mind is this idea of the dragon spirit, or the dragon. What does the dragon represent, right? What is the core of the dragon? And I was thinking of those Alex Gray paintings with the, the spirit of the human energy fields, like a chakra fields of the human chakras, right? But for the dragon. And if you put that on the cross, it's saying, what are we showing? And we obviously know the mystery of Golgotha, right? The mystery of Golgotha in which Christ's sacrifice is like the X marks the spot over the spiritual hot spot, right? But if we kind of zoom into that cross, what's at the center of the cross? Well, it's the heart, right? It's a heart, and that's the dragon heart. And you go through mythology of the dragon heart, and you think of the dragon heart strings, right? The idea of what is the heart of the dragon, or you slay the dragon through the heart, or something like this. But on the other side of it, it's a dynamic, energetic source. It's a source of this amazing power, right? But it's power that's been self-controlled through its alignment to the cross, right? And so what you come out of this with, this core strength, this core dragon strength, it comes through back to the cross again. But now it's starting to transform. This is the alchemical transformation. So it's almost like, imagine the wings retract a bit. The wings retract around the cross. And then that heart, at the core of it, that dragon heart, in a way is the sacred heart of Jesus by the Catholics would call it, right? So you actually have the dragon heart is the sacred heart, right? And that kind of imagery takes us to the idea of the coalescing of that dragon energy, the pulling in the wings, right? So we go from inflation, ego inflation, and then we go to alignment to the earth again. We come back, we ground it. How do we ground that? Well, we close the wings. We focus on what is the heart. We know you hear the heartbeat, and you recognize that we're back to Christ's sacrifice again, but now it's formed in the sense of a dragon heart, which is actually the sacred heart, and which is actually a kind of an egg, right? So you see the dragon egg, and within that dragon egg there are the cross is within the egg. So the dragon and the egg and the cross, they all become part of it. Well, what is the egg? Well, it's the alchemical egg, right? This is the alchemy's winged egg is part of the philosopher's stone, right? And if you kind of keep going into that, you see that the dragon egg is the cross, and it is the sacred heart of Jesus, right? And so that imagery of the dragon egg brings us back through to the implementation of this, whether it's through the traditional Christian story or a Rosicrucian retelling of the Christian story, or a new tool set that allows you to sort of think through that, right? So now you have that same, without detracting from the Christ story, we come through the other side. And in that consciousness, you're now in the place of saying, oh, if I align with that cross feeling, like Yogananda said, if you align to the power of that, this is how you really know it, right? You really know what that is. And then suddenly it's not a disrespect to the Christian traditions, and it's also not a stagnation or a passive acceptance of a dogma. It's a creative alchemical process, like a Jungian alchemical process that takes the creative imagination, it guides it through a groundedness in the earth, but also a spiritual link to the idea of the Logos, which is above. And you sort of see this as the alchemical. This is the alchemical egg. This is the transformation. And I think this is what, I think in a way, this was the redemption for, let's say, for Anno's life, where he kind of went through this story. And I think I'll do a whole story on the 3.0, 1.0 as an alchemical journey. But I just wanted to share this different approach with you guys. The idea of how do we account for the post-Rosicrucian Christianity, and what can we do with it that's still respects its spirit and its mysteries, but at the same time allows us for some active interaction with it. So you're starting out with the story of Christ pulling himself off the cross, or an ego inflation saying something to do with dragons in Christ. But as you bind it back down, and let's call it like a genomic binding, like we bind it back down to the genome, which is in the anthropos. Behold the man. They said, behold the man, right? So the wings fold, and what remains is the dragon heart, which is the sacred heart. So you see how we get a new set of tools to think about the mystery with. And I mean, in the hands of an artist or a world builder, someone like Hideki Anno does in the rebuild of Evangelion, he actually is following this kind of Yogananda Christ consciousness, second coming of Christ within you, as opposed to, it's got the dressings of something apocalyptic, just as this has the idea of a satanic Christ composite, when in fact it's trying to reconcile with Jung's aeon, the idea of how do we move past the idea of Manichaean heresy and look more to a Manichaean psychology, which is where each of us are in the cross of our choices. We're each in the cross of our choices, and we can be creative. We can use some ego inflation because we can be artistic in that space. But then when we ground it back down to our genome, to our humanity, to the anthropos, this is where we find our grounding in it, and we find our task is really easy from that point on. Whether you're an artist or you're a writer, or if you are just a creative thinker in general, you can do these kind of creative experiments, and then as long as you pull back and remember, hey, I'm just the kid who had that dream of the imp falling off the cross, right? And this is just part of a whole other construct, and you can find ways to reconcile those things and find ways to redeem it and keep true to the good aspects of it. So yeah, so I wanted to leave it at that. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I probably will go ahead and do another Evangelion one. I do want to do the last podcast in our Dragon podcast, and interestingly enough, it will go down that genomic route where we'll talk a bit about the reptilian origins, right? Reptilian origins will kind of be it, but it'll be mostly the idea of how does the dragon mythology, how does the snake and dragon mythology align with a very simple neurostructure of, let's say, the lizard brain, we'll call it, but just the idea of maybe there's a evolutionary reconciliation that happens as we moved from evolving from things without a cerebellum to a mammalian form, and that gap for us from mammal back to lizard, maybe there's something in that that's very interesting to look at, and maybe that's the origin of a lot of this dragon mythology, or even this, even the fear of reptilian aliens. Maybe we can just ground it down to the amygdala, right? Is it just the idea that we must reconcile with Panksepian instinct around fear and fight and flight and food, right? And drives that we have. So yeah, so that'll be the last one. We'll do a dragons and the reptile origins of mankind. We'll do that as our last wrap up. Guys, hope you like what we're doing here. This just happened to fall in December, so have a great holiday, everyone. And if you like what we're doing here, like and subscribe, share it, ring the bell. Check out our bookstore. You can get some last-minute gifts for people out there, and we will talk to you in the next podcast. Thank you for making this far, and appreciate your comments below. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.